Terror and Error. Last month, the so-called War on Terror hit home. I hadn't directly known anyone killed in the attacks of 9/11, though my New York daughter, then 22, witnessed the attacks from the deck of the aircraft carrier Intrepid at Midtown. Children of my friends and relatives who deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan all made it home safely, thank goodness. But I was sitting at home on Patriots Day when I first heard the news about bombs exploding at the Boston Marathon. And I knew that Melissa Clayton, my strong right arm, and the administrative linchpin that keeps this church functioning, was a volunteer at the marathon. I dialed her cell phone number immediately. The call must have come just before the blackout, because thank goodness she picked up. She said she was unhurt but was not able to talk, as it was chaos at that moment. Later, as she was leaving the city and the cell phones were restored to use, she texted me to thank me for my call and said that she had been 150 feet away from the first blast. This week, Melissa told her story to the men's group breakfast. And it hit me how fortunate she was, and we were, that she wasn't standing a few feet closer to the bomb. So I start my reflections on terrorism from a very personal note. This latest act could have seriously injured or killed someone we all care about very deeply in this church. Ironically, Melissa has been engaged in training for emergency responses of all kinds: blizzards, nuclear meltdowns, hurricanes, floods, as well as terrorist atrocities. She worked at the shelter during the blizzard last February in Dennis Young Hospital. It reminds you that while the media focuses on the few bad apples, the ones who plan and cause harm, behind the scenes there is always a small army of people who are being trained to help, to comfort, to heal when any natural or man-made disaster strikes. In the Boston case, though she was probably in shock, Melissa spent the time just after the bombs went off operating a gate to let the ambulances through the crowd. The cooperation and coordination of this rescue effort led to an amazing statistic. Of almost 200 who were injured, some severely, no additional people died of their injuries. This is a serious and very emotional subject. But the title of the sermon comes directly from a joke I saw on Facebook a few months ago. Every time you make a typo, the errorists win. What I want to do this morning is to take a look at America's so-called war on terror in light of the recent events in Boston and Washington, and in light of certain religious principles. And I invite you to turn to the back of your order of service, or the 5th page after the title of your hymnal, to review our 7 principles. Among the other values we covenant to affirm and promote are the 4th, a free and responsible search for truth and meaning. The 6th, the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. The 7th, respect for the interconnected web of all existence of which we are a part. The 2nd, justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And especially the 1st, the inherent worth and dignity of every person. My take on this first principle is that the word inherent is sort of like the word inalienable in the Declaration of Independence. It means a quality which is part of the essence of a person, which can never be taken away. When we're dealing with people who are committing acts of great harm and destruction, whom the world at large, our neighbors and many reasonable people, hate and revile, it is important to put the preamble with the first principle. We're covenanting to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person. We're not saying that every person has inherent worth and dignity as a matter of fact. We're saying that our religion is based on a promise to treat every person as if they had worth and dignity. And inherent means that worth and dignity is never taken from them. Now, the principles and purposes were composed in 1984. There are other statements of belief, both in Unitarianism and Universalism before this, but the values behind them go back thousands of years. Jesus enunciated some very tough precepts in the Sermon on the Mount, which I read a few moments ago. Love your enemies. I say this is tough advice, and there will be few of us who will be able to follow it completely. But as much as the teachings of Jesus have been distorted down through the ages, as much as this advice has been ignored by people who claim to be Christians, the words still stand as a beacon for us, a gold standard for behavior. And our Universalist forebears conceived of a God who is too loving to condemn anyone to hell. No, not even the most abject sinner, the worst person imaginable. And they conceived that to follow such a God, one needed to try to access that kind of divine love in our own hearts. Which is why some Universalists, such as Charles Spear, who was the first Universalist minister in Brewster, led the way in the abolition of the death penalty and in the reform of the penal system. It's easy to love the lovable, my friends. What tests and expands our capacity for love is to love difficult people, and people especially who have done harm to us or to those we love. Can we affirm the worth and dignity of Stalin, Hitler, Idi Amin, Mao Zedong, Osama bin Laden, and now Tamerlan and Dzhokhar Tsarnaev? What do these organizations have in common? Hezbollah, Hamas, Abu Nidal, Basque Fatherland and Liberty, Kurdistan Workers' Party, Palestine Liberation Front, Shining Path, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Al-Qaeda, the Real Irish Republican Army, Liberation Tigers of Tamil Elam. What these groups have in common is that each of them appears on a list compiled and maintained by the U.S. State Department of foreign terrorist organizations, and each of these organizations were placed on that list prior to September 11, 2001. Now, some of these organizations are still in the news today, such as Hezbollah and Hamas, but many of them have faded away or morphed into other groups in the last decade. One group of this list will stand out today, Al-Qaeda. That is the only group which has directly targeted the United States in its terrorist activities. Though there are varying opinions on this, I accept for the purposes of this argument that Al-Qaeda is the group responsible for the September 11th attacks, the single deadliest terrorist attacks anywhere. And thus it is no coincidence that Al-Qaeda is the only terrorist group on which the U.S. has declared war. President George W. Bush frequently used the phrase war on terror, but under our Constitution, only Congress can declare war. And the measure enacted by Congress on September 14, 2001, authorized the President, quote, to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States by such nations, organizations, or persons, end quote. This provision, the so-called Authorization for Use of Military Force, or AUMF, is the legal basis for the war on terror, as well as for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So it was no small matter when it came up as the subject of hearings in the U.S. Senate this week. Representatives of the Pentagon and the Obama administration basically claimed that the AUMF gave them the legal authority to strike at any terrorists anywhere in the world by drone or any other means. They claimed the right not only to go against Al-Qaeda, but also associated forces. They also said the state of warfare could last for another decade. All this elicited a shocked reaction from Angus King, the new senator from Maine. Quote, Gentlemen, I've only been here 5 months, but this is the most astounding and most astoundingly disturbing hearing that I've been to since I've been here. You guys have essentially rewritten the Constitution here today. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, clearly says that the Congress has the power to declare war. Senator King continued, this is one of the most fundamental divisions in our constitutional scheme, that the Congress has the power to declare war. The President is the Commander-in-Chief and prosecutes the war. But you're reading this AUMF in such a way as to apply clearly outside of what it says. Senator McCain was absolutely right. It refers to the people who planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks on September 11th. That's a date. That's a date. It doesn't go into the future. And then it says, or harbored such organizations, past tense, or persons in order to prevent any future acts by such nations, organizations, or persons. It established a date, unquote. It is heartening to see at least someone in the Congress who is no longer willing to write a blank check to the administration on waging war. But it should be obvious to all of us now that the concept of military force is wildly wrong for combating terrorism. This is the fundamental error of the war on terror. What was committed on September 11, 2001 was essentially a splashy and successful crime. Using very low-tech means, box cutters, an organized and disciplined gang of suicide adventurers were able to gain control of 3 out of 4 high-tech facilities, jet airliners, in such a way that they caused substantial damage to 2 high-profile targets. The hijackers gained control of the 4th jetliner as well, but the passengers prevented them from achieving their objective. While this was atrocious, it captured everyone's attention and seared our psyches. The response to this event has been, in retrospect, out of all proportion to the provocation. Al-Qaeda did succeed in changing the American way of life, and we and our leaders have cooperated in that. We militarized our reaction to this horrific stimulus, and it has left us fighting 2 hot wars, and after those have wound down, in a perpetual state of war that has no endpoint. We had endured attacks by Al-Qaeda before, at the embassy in Nairobi, and on the USS Cole. Another Islamic militant group had tried to attack the World Trade Center. We had endured an attack on a federal building in Oklahoma City. In none of these had it felt required to declare war, nor to rip up the constitutional protections in the criminal justice system. The Oklahoma City bomber and the plotters of the first World Trade Center attack were prosecuted in federal court. Justice was served. More importantly, the responses to those acts of terrorism diminished the terrorists, whereas the American overreaction to the September 11th attacks has served as Al-Qaeda's greatest recruitment tool. Other nations have endured many more acts of terrorism without resort to the tactic of declaring war on a gang of thugs. Great Britain endured many terrorist actions by various factions of the Irish Republican Army from 1970 to 2001. Typically, the bombs did not kill many, but caused a great deal of property damage. For example, a truck bomb at Bishopsgate in London in 1993 caused nearly $1 billion worth of damage. According to Wikipedia, the insurance payments required were so enormous that Lloyd's of London almost went bankrupt under the strain, and there was a crisis in the London insurance market. You'll see on the front cover of your order of service a picture of a mask. Does anyone know who that mask represents? That mask represents one of the earliest terrorists we have in history, a man named Guy Fawkes. In 1605, he was a Catholic crusader to try to get the throne of England back into the Catholic camp, and he was going to blow up Parliament with a group of plotters. He had a whole bunch of gunpowder underneath the buildings in Parliament when he was caught. And Britain, England always celebrates Guy Fawkes Day on, I think it's November 5th. And they burned him in effigy. So that's not holding up Great Britain as a great example of forgiveness. They still have to forgive Guy Fawkes. And Also, that Guy Fawkes mask gets used in Occupy recently. I did not like that use of it because I think, whatever you may say of Guy Fawkes, he was a terrorist. But traditionally, the point is, traditionally wars are fought between sovereign nations. The war on Al-Qaeda was essentially an affair between a nation of more than 300 million people and a gang who might have numbered 500 at the maximum. But now we're entering onto a new phase, a stage articulated by Kenneth Roth, the executive director of Human Rights Watch, in his testimony at Thursday's hearing in the Senate. Quote, "The combination of a declared global war and the newly enhanced capacity to kill individual targets, far from any traditional battlefield, poses new dangers to basic rights, ones that will only grow as the U.S. role in the Afghan armed conflict winds down. That leaves only Al-Qaeda and similar armed groups, but without the elements that traditionally limit the use of the war power, the control of territory, and a recognizable battlefield. To paint the problem most starkly, might a government that wants to kill a particular person simply declare war on him and shoot him, circumventing the basic due process rights to which the target would ordinarily be entitled? Or might a government intent on wiping out a drug gang simply declare a war on its members?" Unquote. In other words, is there a limit to how small an entity can be before we can declare war on it? We have drug cartels, as Mr. Roth points out. We have the mafia. We might have a bunch of protesters lying down in a nuclear power plant. Any of these might pose some danger to the public at large. Might we declare war on them? Or to bring it home, we have a recent act of terror committed on U.S. soil, Massachusetts soil to be precise, by a gang of 2. Thus far, there is no publicly reported evidence that the Tsarnaev brothers were supported by any organization larger than the 2 of them. And now one of them is dead. And many people have been calling for the surviving brother to be treated as an enemy combatant under the laws of war, rather than being prosecuted in the courts. Fortunately, the current administration is not listening. It has not ordered a drone strike against Dzhokhar Tsarnaev, but his brother proceeded by way of criminal charges. He may get the death penalty at the end, but he will at least get some measure of due process in the meantime. But the whole affair has exposed a very ugly strain of retribution in the public and in the politicians who court that public. I understand well and sympathize with all those who are revolted at the crime. If anything was an evil act, this bombing was. But the distinguishing mark of the inherent decency of a people is how we react to evil among us. And while I understand the revulsions, I'm just as revolted by those who have denied the dead bombing suspect a decent burial as I am by the bombers themselves. An article in this week's online version of The New Yorker by a classic scholar put the burial controversy in the perspective of millennia. Daniel Mendelsohn, who teaches at Bard College, pointed out that unburied bodies were a strong concern of ancient Greek literature. Quote, "From its epic dawn to its tragic high noon, Greek literature expressed tremendous cultural anxiety about what happens when the dead are left unburied. In part, the issue was a religious one. The souls of the dead were thought to be stranded, unable to reach the underworld without proper burial. The religious prohibition had civic consequences. Refusal to bury the dead was considered an affront to the gods and could bring ritual pollution on the community. The right of all sides to bury soldiers who had fallen in battle was a convention of war. Burial truces were regularly granted. In myth, even characters who act more like terrorists than like soldiers, for instance, the great warrior Ajax, who plots to assassinate his commanding officers but ends up dead himself, are deemed worthy of burial in the end. Which is to say, even the body of the enemy was sacrosanct." Unquote. The play which expresses this most vividly, which revolves around an unburied body, is Sophocles' Antigone. Antigone, the title character, is a daughter of Oedipus, the ill-fated king of Thebes, and she had 2 brothers, Polynices and Aeolus. Polynices left the city and raised a group of terrorists to come attack it. Eteocles defended the city. Both brothers were killed, but Eteocles was given a funeral with full honors. The Theban king Cleon, brother of Oedipus, decreed that Polynices was not to be buried, but his corpse was to be left in the open to be devoured by the birds and beasts. Antigone pleads with Cleon, but he is unmoved. Antigone goes out under cover of night to scatter a little symbolic dirt on the body of her brother. For this disobedience, she is imprisoned, where she eventually hangs herself. Creon's son, Antigone's fiancé, kills himself when he learns of her death, and Creon's wife kills herself in despair at the loss of her son. Thus the king comes to revoke his cruel and irreligious decree only after he has lost all the people dear to him in life. The ancient Greeks, in short, recognized the sacred obligation to bury all the dead, including the worst enemy of the people. We have retreated from that high standard today, and it is as if an act sufficiently horrifying strips a person of all humanity. I'm particularly appalled at the political figures who have taken part in this charade, Mayor Menino and Representative Markey, while I applaud Governor Patrick's refusal to make a public recommendation for or against burial. The only two people who acted decently in this matter, it seems to me, are the funeral home director in Worcester and the woman in Virginia who finally got on the phone and arranged the burial there. Acts of violence, my friends, acts of violence produce anxiety among us. They push our buttons. They trigger our flight or fight responses that evolution has given us deep in our brains. That is understandable, but it is not a very wise basis for policy. We would be well to heed what Lincoln called the better angels of our nature, to take seriously Jesus' unambiguous teaching to love our enemy, and if we can't love him, at least not to strip him of all shreds of human dignity. We can't combat terrorism without debasing ourselves. Like any criminal enterprise, terrorist cells should be infiltrated and as much intelligence as possible brought to bear on derailing plans which may harm the public if carried out. We've been fairly successful since 9/11 in breaking up actions, such as the shoe bomber. Unleashing military violence in response to terrorist violence may satisfy some urge for retribution, but it does little to make us safer. And it is no joke. When we overreact to terror, the terrorists win. Corporations like Halliburton have made billions out of the so-called war on terror, and the military-industrial complex continues to profit and to lobby for more expensive weapons systems. The public is understandably interested in safety, but nothing government does can completely ensure that lone actors like these guys won't improvise explosive devices. The facts of the Boston bombing, the manhunt and the death of Cameron, and the lockdown and apprehension of Shokar provided a field day for the media and absorbed the attention of many of us for days. But it is now clear that these two were bumbling amateurs, using low-tech recipes they found on the internet, improvising plans as they went along. Pressure cookers and gunpowder from fireworks. This is hardly the mark of a competent terrorist. I mourn the loss of innocent lives, the maiming and disability of those injured, and am thankful the casualty toll was not higher. We can't completely guard against these individual acts. We can, however, control what we pay attention to and how we react, and we can resist the urge to glorify violence and feed the egos of glory seekers such as these two brothers. Amen.